It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulson and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome in. Take Command podcast. Logan Paulson there. Craig Hoffman here. And it is time to preview the Commanders and New Orleans Saints. And this is going to be interesting, Logan, because it does feel like the Commanders should win this game by a whole lot, which they've done at times this year against some other opponents. Some of these matchups that we've gone in and been like, I don't know, the way this thing lines up on paper, seems like the Commanders should win by a whole bunch. Obviously, the Cowboys game felt that way to an extent, but it was a division game, and obviously it went a different direction. But coming off the bye and looking at this game in general, there is a lot to get to, and I don't know how much of it is going to be good if you're a Saints fan trying to listen in and find some hope on a Commanders podcast.
Yeah, I mean, excuse me, I think the thing in watching the film and kind of, just thinking about this game, this reminds me a lot of like the Dallas game, in terms of like what it feels like when you're watching the film. Like, I think the defense is pretty good. I think it's better than the Saints defense, better than people want to give it credit for. They're fast. They've got some good athletes on the defensive line that maybe aren't playing up to snuff, but they can create pressure. They can create hurries, all those different things. And then on offense, they've got the quarterback issue, right? Who's going to play quarterback? All their receivers are hurt. It just seems like it's kind of built for the Commanders to put the ball on the tee and knock this thing out of the park. And I think that's the thing about this that maybe in terms of watching film and kind of reviewing that I think is maybe my biggest takeaway. It's what are the Commanders going to do? Are they going to be themselves, or are they going to be the Commanders we saw versus the Giants? And I think this is coming out of the bye. Like, we haven't really talked about this a ton, but it can be really, really challenging, I think, coming out of the bye as a player and as a coach and as a team, especially a late bye, depending on what you do. Like, you're kind of in a rhythm. You've got the thing going. You've got the momentum. You just got that win. And it can kind of break that up. The bye can kind of break that momentum up. So I think that's something that, again, I think is maybe the most compelling story about the game. And we're going to preview the Saints more, obviously, but it's really what the Commanders are and who we think they are, and can they be this team that can handle, kind of being a favorite and coming in and beating a team. And again, like, people don't want to talk about this, but heading down New Orleans is a tough trip. So there's a lot of things here that are kind of like sneaky that could trip you up, but good teams don't get tripped up in these situations and they win these games.
So let's talk about that before we dive into the X's and O's on either side of this, because to me, in 10 years of covering the NFL, like, I just think I've come to the conclusion that coming out of the bye is on some level a skill. Now, there's always going to be other factors, right? Like, who you play coming out of the bye is really important. How good you are is really important. And some of the guys I'm about to mention as coaches have typically had really good teams, so that's helpful. But like, Mike Tomlin, I think, is like undefeated or has some ridiculous, like 14-2 kind of record or something like that coming off the bye. Andy Reid is forever been one of the best in the league coming off the bye. So you have some of these great coaches that have figured out how to get their teams refocused and just continue rolling, if they are good teams, to keep playing well coming out of the bye. When you think back to your career, what are some things that you think that coaches did or that you did that worked after that week off, like how you treated the bye and then how you came out of it? And then what are some things that you're like, whoops, that wasn't a good idea?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I don't know if I have a good answer because, you have 10 NFL seasons, it's 10 games, 10 bye weeks. It's kind of a small sample size. So I don't know if there's anything that definitively stuck out. I will say I felt like this is going to sound crazy. I felt like there were teams that overworked during the bye and came back and were flat. And I felt like there were teams that underworked coming into the bye and then came out flat. So I do think there is a kind of sweet spot depending on the team, depending on the organization, depending on the coach from a work standpoint. Because some people say, oh, they should work the whole bye week. But mentally, it's pretty fatiguing, right? Also, I think there's another element here, too, that kind of piggybacks off that point, is there were teams that would install a lot during the bye. I think back to Kyle Shanahan a couple times, like in San Francisco, and when I was here with him in Washington, I think it was 2011, they'd have a big install in the bye week, and then you'd come into the game and it would just be a little bit too much. Like, you couldn't own it well enough to really take advantage of it. And so I think there is an art to kind of threading that needle and saying we want to be, evolving as an offense, evolving as a defense, but we don't want to have too much a too significant departure from what we were before. We want to work, but we don't want to overwork. We don't want to underwork. So there is kind of a line. And I do think, I was talking to Fred and Santana yesterday on the Command Center podcast, and one of the things that they said was like, it's the coach kind of sets the energy and the tempo going into the bye. Hey, take care of yourself, take care of the team, be smart, call an Uber, all those different kind of checklist things. Coming out of the bye, it's really the team leadership. So, like for us, when I was here in Washington, it was like London Fletcher. And then also like making sure you have the right guys on the team, which is something we've talked about quite a bit, like making sure that, everyone's a self-starter, everyone's self-motivated, because they're going to handle the bye in the way they need to in order to make sure they're ready to come out. And I feel like those were, and Tana made this point, but those were the best teams that I was a part of, were teams that were kind of made up of the right composition. I'm not saying everyone was perfect, but there was enough good leadership to be like, hey, Fred Davis coming out of the bye, let's make sure he's ready to go, or whoever that person is, because there was enough kind of the right people that were ready to kind of attack the last half of the season or the last 4 games or whatever it was. So to me, in terms of like winning formula, it's a coach who understands how to prep the bye, the leadership coming out of the bye, and then making sure the roster is where it needs to be from a individual standpoint to handle a bye week.
Yeah, and so Dan, I think, told the guys pretty much like, hey, get away. And like it was funny, multiple guys walking off the podium after that Titans game were like, man, I'm going to enjoy this bye. And by the way, one of those people was Dan Quinn, where he was just like, I'm ready to not see you guys for a couple weeks or for a week. Because you've been doing it. It's not just since September. Like they've been going basically nonstop since late July in training camp. You have that little bit of time by the end of camp into week 1, but you're just rearing to go for week 1. And you have the mini buys and whatever, but it's just not the same as like, hey, we're fully disengaged. We're out of it for a couple days. Now let's dive back in. And I love that Quinn had the bonus day on Monday, because if Wednesday is kind of your regular rhythm, like a chance to knock off the rust is great. Like that just makes sense to me. So I like that. The other thing that I think is interesting, and I wanted to pick your brain on real quick before we dive in full bore to the Saints, is Scott Abraham asked a question of Dan, and Dan gave him a little bit of gruff for it about, hey, you got the playoffs, you control your own destiny. And Dan was basically like, Scott, did you just log on? Like what? That's not how we do things around here. And it's funny because it certainly is how Dan operates. It's like one practice at a time, one thing at a time. But if you watch, for instance, the NFC North edition of Hard Knocks that's out now, I think Mike Tomlin, I think actually all 4 coaches, but definitely Mike Tomlin and Zach Taylor and other coaches that have had John Harbaugh have had a ton of success. Like they'll put the path on the board. Like this is our schedule for the rest of the season. So the idea that NFL coaches don't do this is not correct. It's not how Dan chooses to do it. And I'm not saying either one is right or wrong, but I do think like on a human psychology level, coming out of this bye with 4 games to go, knowing that you've got everything you want in front of you, that's got to be invigorating versus like, if you came off a late bye and you were already eliminated from the playoffs, you don't want to come back to work.
100%.
But what do you think about the kind of the way that different coaches have handled this? And you've obviously played for Dan, so the idea that like, hey, we're just very focused, one practice at a time, versus when he gets into that meeting room on Monday coming off the bye, it's, hey guys, welcome back. This is what's in front of us.
Yeah, and I can only speak on what happened in 2017, which was a little unique, right? Like I remember at the time, he was still kind of like, be where your feet are. That was a big part of what he did. But I do remember him very early in the season kind of talking about, hey, these are because we didn't start the season well. Like we kind of struggled coming out the gate. And so he'd put up on the board like, hey, these are our remaining divisional games. These are the remaining games, our non-conference games. And we're going to have to like figure it out and turn it on here if we want to make a push for the playoffs, which is what we all want to do. So obviously that situation was a little bit different. And I've had coaches that have done that too. But I also think that this model is of kind of like be where your feet are is maybe the most important one, right? Because we just talked about like, obviously you kind of maybe look past Dallas, the first Dallas game. Like as much as people want to talk about, there's 4 games left, you control your own destiny, all those kind of things. I will say this is the most important game you've ever had in your life. And it's against the New Orleans Saints. And say what you want about them, like that is the mindset. And so I do think there is something very clarifying when a coach does that. Hey, I don't care about Philly. I don't care about Dallas. I don't care about, I don't know who's the other game, whatever it is.
Atlanta.
I don't care about those games. This is the one. Because if we don't take care of this one, then there's this crazy undue stress. And I've been a part of teams that have done this too, where you say, hey, here are the 4. We got to win 3 of these. And you lose the first one, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, shoot. Like, we got Philly coming in here. We got a rival in Dallas. We got Atlanta who's doing their thing. Like, and then there's this undue pressure on those games, right? Which you kind of fabricated, right? It's this one right now. We got New Orleans. Right. Let's win this one. And then we got the next one. And then that's the most important one. And I do think, because the guys are aware, they know, like they watch enough. They're on their Instagram, they're on TikTok, they're on Twitter enough. They watch enough TV to know that we are in control. The team's in control of their own destiny. And so as a leader, like, you don't need to inform them of that. He might, but I don't think you need to. And just say, hey, like this, if we take care of this one, we're at 9. And then he knows they need one more. But if you treat everyone like it's a playoff game, like this is the one opportunity, I think that's the way to go about it, right? And so I do think that there's something really, from a player's perspective, very like alleviating about it. It's like, hey, don't worry about that. That's tomorrow. Today is right now. It's New Orleans. Let's get this thing done and get this win. And so I do think, if in comparing the two styles, for me personally, I like this one a little bit better. Like, we're not talking 4 games left. This is their winning. No, this is the one. Boom. Let's get it off the schedule and then let's get on to the next.
I feel like about 10 seconds ago, you got to do a little bit of Coach Logan mode. I was ready to go.
I felt it.
I was
coming.
ready to go. I'm ready to hit somebody. So Michael Phillips said that when he joined me on Monday, and I was like, anybody in particular? He's like, no, just kind of generally speaking, ready to hit somebody. I was like, okay, we can deal with that later. Last thing I'll just say to kind of wrap up that point is, I also think, like, either approach can work. If Dan were to switch up now, that would be bad. So this is who he's been the entire year, and part of the consistency of the team outside of the Dallas game, which, like, again, they're human. It's the NFL. It's hard to get with no slip-ups is tremendously difficult. But the consistency of his messaging all year has been a part of their success. So if he were to come back from the bye, it's like, all right, guys, let's widen the lens a little bit now that we're here at the end of the road. That would obviously not make a lot of sense. And so to continue just, hey, we've been good. Let's keep doing what we're doing. Trust the process. Like, that's good with me.
And I also think, to your point there, it depends on the team. Like, if the team's a little bit older, a little bit more mature, and they can lock in each week kind of with this information about the next 4 games, that's its own thing. And I think one of the great things about head coaches and good leaders is they can identify what this group needs. And I do look at it as kind of a young group at certain spots. You know, you're playing a lot of rookies. You got a young quarterback. And I do think, and I would assume it's just kind of nice for the quarterback specifically to be like, hey, don't worry about that. This is it. And, you know, it was funny. I was talking to Tana and Fred yesterday, and one of the things they kept saying, it's like, it's playoff football now. And so, like, win or go home type of stuff. And I think, again, that for players it kind of tightens you up a little bit, but it's also kind of paradoxically very liberating, because it's like, we got to win this one. There's no tomorrow, and we can just kind of pour all of our focus into this. And I think that's what this feels like to me. And when Dan says stuff like that, you know, kind of tongue in cheek a little bit to Scott, it's like that's good, because, like you said, it's on brand, it's right for this team, it's consistent for this season. So I think it feels like the right thing for this group.
No doubt about it. I think it's great, and we'll see how the mentality plays out on Sunday. I always kind of laugh at the term, like, must-win game. I always reject it. And I'm just like, or what? Like, what do you talk, must win or what? But it does feel like this, I'll phrase it this way. This would be a tremendous missed opportunity if they do not win this game. And so with that, let's dive into this game. Take command, Craig Hoffman, Logan Paulson. Let's talk about the Saints offense, because we got to do it at some point in this podcast, and I'd rather just get it out of the way. Commanders defense are going to face a very banged up unit led by Question mark. Transparently, we are recording this Wednesday morning, which is a day earlier than we usually do our previews, which for injury report purposes is not great. So we do not know who the Saints are going to start at quarterback. What we do know is they have 3 less than stellar options. Option 1 is Derek Carr, who is going to have a broken hand on his non-throwing hand, which ball handling, catching snaps, all that kind of stuff. Like, it's not just because, like, if it was his throwing hand, he obviously couldn't play at all, but that is something that can absolutely affect a quarterback. He's also battling a concussion, so he's probably not going to practice all week. So you get that version of Derek Carr, or Spencer Rattler, who's coming off injury and potentially could be available this weekend, or Jake Haener, or they'd sign Ben DiNucci. So that's your options. None of them are very good. And by the way, Taysom Hill out for the year. Chris Olave out. Like, they are just supremely under-talented on offense in a way that feels like the Commanders' defense should be able to have another performance where they hold a team under 20 points, if not, frankly, Logan, better than that.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to start the podcast, because I think when you look at what they did early in the season, the Saints, they were able to kind of find these explosive opportunities, whether it was to Chris Olave or number 22, Shaheen.
Shaheen.
Yeah. And then, and they were very successful, like kind of off play action, kind of traditional Kyle Shanahan stuff. And all those guys that I just mentioned, Olave, Shaheen, like, they're all hurt, right? And so then they kind of go back to the drawing board, reevaluate. They got Cedric Wilson Jr., who was the 3 in Miami last year. They got Kevin Austin Jr., who I've never heard of before. And they got Marcus Valdez-Scantling as their kind of like number 1 explosive play threat. And when like MVS has entered the lineup, they've been able to find some explosive opportunities. So even though they're a little banged up, they've kind of been able to like rigmarole it together and find some things to do. However, their quarterback's banged up. And say what you want about Derek Carr, I do think he's played on the whole pretty well this year for him. You know what I mean? I think he's kind of done a good job of finding these explosive opportunities, anticipating throws, building connection and relationship. But again, he's hurt, right? So, excuse me. So I think that is something that like really paints the picture in the backdrop of this team. That like early in the season, they were able to kind of find, again, these explosive plays down the field, run first to set up the pass type deal. Now the set up the pass stuff doesn't have the teeth that it had earlier in the season. So then you look at how they're running the ball. And I do think that they are good up front. Like, their offensive line is maybe not the best in the NFL, but they're definitely above average, right? They've kind of gelled together well. They're relatively healthy. They're big. They're physical. However, like, as you pointed this out, like, Alvin Kamara is, a guy that he's leading the team in targets. He's leading the team in carries. He's been very effective. He's kind of in this Christian McCaffrey type mold. But when you watch the Giants game, for example, they can't really run the football super effectively because there's not this threat of kind of getting behind the defense that we saw earlier in the season. And I think you see a less effective Alvin Kamara. And I think if he's not effective, this offense really has nobody to make it go, if that makes sense. Like sometimes when you watch a team, you're like, oh, they can get it done with quick game. They can get it done with screens. They can get it done with RPOs. And he was really the driving force, Kamara, for a long time. But now it just seems like he's a little out of gas. And he's still an effective weapon, no doubt about it, but just not with the same efficiency we saw early in the season.
Yeah, or earlier in his career. This season, Kamara has forced a missed tackle on just 19.9% of his touches. That is his lowest missed tackle rate since 2018 per Next Gen Stats from NFL Pro. So it is a struggle, just like both of us talking today on this podcast. By the way, also Rashid Shaheed. That's my bad on the name there. So sorry, Rashid. You're very fast and very talented, and the Saints miss you very much. They will chuck it. That is the thing that like if you tell me what scares or ask me what scares me about this team, and especially when Carr's in there, I don't have a file on Jake Haener. Sorry, Jake. But
watch all his throws the other day. So if you want file, we can talk about him in a second.
Yeah, we should, because I think he's the most likely guy. But like, they will be aggressive with their play calls. They will chuck it. They also do some, like, they had a 3rd and 5 where they ran it with Kamara for a first down against the Giants. So like, they'll do some stuff that's I guess surprising, from a play calling standpoint. But I do think that variability, and especially if they're playing against a team where they know, like, God, offensively, they're going to put up some points, the way Washington's played, That's the one thing that scares me, is that they might take a ton of shots and just hope that they draw some PIs or, which they did, by the way, end of the half against the Giants. They just like started chucking it deep and they got a PI and wound up having a field goal attempt that got blocked. But, that variability is really the only thing that scares me about this Saints offense.
No, I think that's right. I think, and again, like the rushing efficiency just hasn't been there. And again, I think the Giants did a good job of basically being like, hey, you're not going to run the football. And again, like when you look at teams that, again, this guy, their offensive coordinator is a Kyle Shanahan disciple. It feels like that when you watch it. I will say for the first like 4 or 5 games, it felt like that. It was like watching a carbon copy, Kyle Shanahan's perspective turned up to 1,000,000. They've gotten out of that a little bit, a little bit more drop back, a little bit more spread it out, kind of a little bit more opportunities like that. But again, they don't have the weapons outside to really scare it. I will say the 2 guys that I think are maybe kind of sleeper weapons for them are Foster Moreau, the tight end, and Juwan Johnson. And Juwan Johnson is a converted wide receiver who's playing tight end, and you see them use him in ways that are interesting to find explosive plays. Like, for example, I think it was in the Giants game. I've watched a lot of film. I don't remember exactly, but they're running a dig on the outside and he runs like an out, which is like a normal, like what I would call bow concept. Like this guy's going to run a sit. This guy's going to, the defender's going to attach to the sit. The dig's going to come in behind. You throw the dig. But as he's kind of running out of the sit, he runs a go. And basically in this cover 2 structure, the safety attacks the dig and the cover 2 player stays low because he thinks he's running an out. And it's an out and go, and there's nobody around. And they can do that with him because he can actually like run a little bit and kind of attack you downfield. So even though they don't have the receiving threats outside and they don't have like that vertical horsepower that they had earlier in the season, like Marcus Valdes-Scantling is dangerous and Juwan Johnson is dangerous as a vertical seam player. He had a nice catch in the seam versus the Giants also. So they do have teeth. Again, their offensive line's playing well. I'm going to give them well, like not amazing, not bad, kind of like that C+, B- range. And they just haven't, so they can hit you with an explosive pass. They haven't been super efficient. And I think maybe the most significant injury for them is Taysom Hill in terms of what he was doing running the football. Because when they got into binds, when they couldn't kind of find that rushing efficiency, he could give them 5 to 8 to 10 explosive run opportunities, 3rd and short situations, even in the field, like with some quarterback kind of RPO zone stuff. They bring their heavy personnel out. He could run it for an explosive gain. He's out. He's hurt. So that is a feature of their offense that, again, it kind of gave them a changeup to the Kamara, and now they don't even have that. So I think kind of how you supplement his production is going to be really challenging because they don't seem to be able to do it kind of with your running back in the dot and the fullback the way they were earlier in the season.
Yeah, they do use their fullback quite a bit, which is interesting. And something that obviously the Commanders are going to need to prep for. And you mentioned the tight ends. They've got like 3 like C+ tight ends that are all fine. They're not very different players, which I think is kind of an interesting thing. It's not like they have a blocking guy and a speed guy. No, it's just like 3 of the same guy that they rotate in. But as you mentioned, Jennings a little bit more explosive as the former converted wide receiver. But that brings us to Haener, because like Derek Carr would throw with anticipation to those guys up the seams, and like, Bobby Wagner's played very well this year in a lot of respects. You can get a ball over his head. Luvu, same thing. Like he's an animal as a pass rusher, but if you can just get him out there in coverage, like you can get a ball up the seam over his head. So if Jake Haener is playing, like, does he make those same throws with that same anticipation as a guy like Carr?
Yeah, turn on the film with Jake Haener. I was really surprised actually with kind of the confidence that he threw the football. Obviously, he's not as physically gifted as Derek Carr. He doesn't have like the arm talent, the quick release, but he's confident, man. He gets back there. He's making tight window throws. He knows where the ball should go. Like sometimes when you watch a backup quarterback, it's like a little bit off. You're like, he's a little bit late, or he's a little bit early, or he's kind of running away from pressure. And the one thing about Haener that I was kind of, and again, it's only like 35 throws, maybe 40 throws on the season. But the one thing I was impressed about is he stuck in there. He threw with anticipation. And so I do think like this is one of those games, and they're not like I'm throwing it a hitch with anticipation. It's like I've got like a return route by number 2 and a corner by number 1 off an inside stem, and it looks like it's covered, but the corner attaches to the return, and I'm going to just layer this thing right over it. So kind of like, I'm going to say like big time throws, but kind of challenging throw difficulties. So again, he's not, Peyton Manning or anything like that, but he seems like a guy that can hurt you. And so again, he's not Derek Carr. He's not that good. He's not that talented, but I do think he could be a guy that if you were to come in not ready for him, he could punch you in the mouth. And you could, again, like some of these explosive plays that we're worried about in terms of like Marcus Valdez-Scantling or Juwan Johnson down the field, like those could pop up and all of a sudden you're like, oh shoot, that's 14 points. Like what happened? Because he does have a little bit of, I'm going to say that moxie word to him, which I was kind of surprised about, honestly.
So if you're Joe Witt, you're trying to heat him up, just trying to get him off his spot, trying to do all the things you try to do to ruffle a rookie quarterback. And by the way, I feel like we should now at this point in the Commanders defense part of the podcast mention we are expecting Marshawn Lattimore to make his debut on very familiar turf, his old turf down in New Orleans. Yeah,
I think the thing is I would probably follow something similar to what the Giants did. And the Giants were, you could tell, very obvious in in their defensive perspective. They're like, we're going to stop the run. We're going to stop the run. We're going to take Alvin Kamara out the game. And they were very comfortable with saying Derek Carr beat us. We're going to play some kind of aggressive, not really aggressive, they're a zone, but more aggressive stuff than they've done earlier in the season. A little bit more man, a little tighter coverage. Just basically like, you're going to be in 2nd and 10 way more than you want to be. You're going to be in 3rd and 10 way more than you want to be. We're going to beat you in those 2nd and 10, 3rd and long situations. And they did. And that was really the formula for that game for them. And say what you want, they lost the game, but New Orleans only scored 14 points. And I think you look at like what drives this offense is the run game, the New Orleans Saints. So can you stop them? And I will say they've got some guys that are big hosses up front. Like Talisi Fuanga is the kid from Oregon State. He's 6'6", like 335. Trevor Penning is the kind of reclamation project for them at right tackle. He was a first-round pick a couple of years ago. I think he's 6'7", like 330. They've got some big dudes. Their center, Eric McCoy's done a great job this year. So they've got some pieces that you're like, on the offensive line, like we got to come in, put our mouthpieces in, stop the run. If we can get that done, if we can stop Alvin Kamara, that's in the screen game, that's in the outside zone, that's in the mid zone. They don't run a lot of like gap scheme stuff, which has hurt us real bad this year, traps and whams. So let's put our mouthpiece in, let's stop the run, and then let's be ready to play some coverage in those 2nd and 10, 3rd and long situations with a quarterback who has some ability, but definitely is not a starting NFL quarterback. I think that feels like the formula to me going into this game.
Yeah, and obviously, if you can get up on them and just make them into a drop back team, that's not going to work. So this is the formula, a trademark, if you will, for how the Commanders have won in blowouts this year. You think it's the offense has to do it. Talk about the offense in a second. What do you expect? This is a guess. We don't know. And maybe by the time some of you guys listen to this, if you save it for Friday, Saturday, Joe Witt Jr. and or Dan Quinn has addressed this. But with Lattimore coming back, do you think it's Sainer still on the outside and Igbenogany in the slot? Do you think that there's a mix and match based off matchup? Do you think St. Juste is out there and Sainer still goes back inside? Like, those are kind of the options. What do you anticipate this weekend and beyond?
Honestly, I don't know. But I guess based on the last couple of games, I would say based on the fact that they were rotating Davis in with St. Juste, and not that St. Juste played badly, it just seems like that they view him as kind of maybe the weaker of the two in terms of consistency and playmaking ability. So I would probably assume that Sanders still stays outside. I think Noah Igbenogany, has done a really good job. So let's keep him in there and let those guys play ball. And maybe you do have like a kind of rotational situation where maybe you're in a little bit more kind of dime with 4 corners. I don't know. I don't know if there's a lot of opportunity for that this game, given the receiving kind of lack of talent for the Saints. But maybe that's what you do. But I do think Sanders still is, I would assume, and again, I have no inside information on this, that he would be the guy that stays and then keep Noah Igbenogany in that role, not because of what he's done as a coverage player, but also how he's played the run. I think that's another thing that people sleep on with him in terms of his physicality. So that feels like the right fit to me, but would I be surprised if it was St. Juste outside and Sanders still in the slot? Absolutely not. I think that would also be very effective.
Yeah, I don't know because they've all had their moments of really good ball this year. They've all had their moments of, oh, yikes. Like Noah's had some scares. I mean, Mikey's coming off a game where he gave up over 100 yards receiving. And we obviously know St. Jude's struggles have been well documented. So I don't know what they do. I tend to think they'll probably change it up a little bit by matchup if there's a particular matchup where they either because of the coverages they're going to call or the man-to-man situation, stylistically where they like St. Juice over Sanders still, they couldn't bump Mikey inside. They also might not want to move him around. So I think that's another thing too, is like how
that's the other one I keep coming back to too, is like
he's been playing outside for so long. Like, yeah, he was inside in camp and the first couple of weeks, but like at this point, he's been outside. If you want to move him back inside, just wait till the offseason and give him an entire offseason to play back inside. I think you probably just keep him outside. I think that's what will happen. But we'll find out on Sunday because it looks like Marshawn Lattimore, barring any last-minute setback, is going to make his debut. Take command. Logan Paulson there. Craig Hoffman here. And it is time to look at the Commanders' offense against a Saints defense that made some plays this year, has a couple of interesting pieces on it, including one very familiar one. But the Commanders' offense coming off that 42-point performance against the Titans where they ran the absolute mess out of the ball. And it would seem, Logan, on paper, that opportunity exists again to have a really good day on the ground and or against New Orleans.
Yeah, that's kind of what it feels like to me. And I think when you watch the Saints, I think, like you said, they do have some interesting pieces, specifically on the edge. Carl Granderson is a guy that maybe isn't a household name, but I think he just plays super hard. He's a big guy. He's kind of a heavy-handed, heavy helmet type of player that is going to set nice vertical edges. I think you look at Chase Young on the other side and kind of feels and plays the same way. Probably not as disciplined, probably not the same motor, but kind of that big edge. And like when you go down the list, like Peyton Turner is a giant. Cameron Jordan is a giant. So they've got kind of some big edge pieces and that's kind of the style that they've wanted to play there for a long time, that can set a nice edge, can stretch a run out. However, and I think that those guys are playing well. Cam Jordan's not playing the same way that he was a couple years ago. Kind of, you can tell he's definitely on the decline. He's not rushing from the end spot anymore. He's more rushing from that 3 technique on third down situations, which I think speaks to kind of the transition of his career, kind of moving away from, one of the more dominant players in the NFL to kind of more of a role player now. And then but I do think the thing about their defense is on the interior, specifically at the defensive tackle spot, you're looking at guys that I think are actually decent athletes, but have been struggling to stop the run, at least to my eye. So Sanders and Shepherds are the 2 guys that start inside. Obviously, John Ridgway and Brian Brzee are the other guys that kind of rotate in with them. And everyone's going to recognize Brian Brzee as a former first-round pick. But those dudes have a really hard time sitting double teams. And when you watch the New York Giants game, they're getting moved off the spot on Wanda. So, open side run away from the tight end, double teams on the interior. Those dudes are getting kind of pushed out of the club. And I think you talk about Pete Werner at the linebacker spot. You talk about Demario Davis at the linebacker spot. Both those guys are doing an excellent job, but sometimes it's hard for them to fit runs when the offensive line's in your lap. And I think when you watch the LA Rams game, for example, they kind of know that they're struggling inside a little bit. So they kind of bring a couple of line stunts. They're trying to scrape the linebackers over the top. And LA did a great job of catching them in those stunts and hitting them for explosive runs. So I think, to me, just looking at, and maybe you have some advanced metrics, Craig, that could support this. When I watch them, I'm the interior is not playing great. They're having a hard time stopping the run. And when I look at the efficiency that they brought, and they also, the other thing, the Commanders have struggled with penetrating 3 techniques. These guys aren't really penetrators. The technique they're playing is kind of read, sit, kind of hold off the double team. And to me, that's perfect. That's exactly what the Commanders want. So the style of play, the technique they're playing, and kind of the lack of consistency from this group, it feels like the Commanders should be right in the Commanders' wheelhouse. They should be able to run the ball. I don't want to say at will because that's an NFL defense, but they should have some success running the ball.
Yeah, the numbers back that up. But just also, I think back to what Nick Allegretti talked about post-Tennessee. And he's we really just wanted to focus on firing off the ball and running off the ball. And a team that penetrates at you, obviously, they're also trying to fire off the ball. And so that's going to play very differently versus a read and sit where it's go strike that guy. He's not coming at you quite as much. And so that should play into what they want to do. And the insights page and the key advantages page on NFL Pro, it is a bloodbath in Washington's favor when you talk about rushing efficiency. Running inside the tackles, Commanders offense, 3. Saints defense, 29th. Overall rushing efficiency, Commanders offense, 3rd. Saints defense, 29th. Rushing in the red zone, Commanders, 3rd. Saints defense, 30th. Design runs, 3rd, 29th. Rushing out of shotgun, 3rd, 28th. Rushing outside the tackles, this one's a little better for the Saints. The Commanders are still 3rd. The Saints are 22nd. QB scrambles, which is something I want to talk about as well. Washington 7th. Saints 27th. Rushing under center 8th, 26th. 9th and 16th for rushing versus light boxes, and 12th and 12th for stack boxes. So maybe the Saints wind up trying to stack the box, but if they're going to play a bunch of man on the outside and like Terry's out there, then Terry could have 200 yards on Sunday. So we'll get to that. But I do think the scrambling element, which has been kind of, go back to a term we used a ton a couple years ago, canary in a coal mine. If Jaden's scrambling, things have typically gone pretty well for Washington's offense.
Which is
his
weird,
ability
because you wouldn't think that would be a good metric. You know what I mean? It wouldn't. You wouldn't think that would be the top. But I know what you mean, because it is actually a very positive metric for the offense, because he is so selective about when to scramble.
So I actually had this conversation in the offseason. We did at the Combine. We did a reporter roundtable, and it was me, Ben Solak, who at the time was with The Ringer and is now at ESPN, and Brooke Pryor. And I was like, just bring a topic to the table. We're going to chop it up. And Solak was like, I think in the next 5 years, like, we are going to understand at a much more extreme level how valuable scrambling is. And the reason is because so often scrambles come in situations that are high leverage, like 3rd down, because teams man up and try to bring pressure, quarterback gets out, and they result in first downs. And so because of that, the EPA per play, estimated points added is EPA, on scrambles is higher than basically any other type of play. So it's not that quarterbacks should then all of a sudden be looking to scramble at all times. Obviously, winning within structure is nice. You can often get big chunks. But because of when those plays tend to happen and the results of them, like, it actually makes a ton of sense that, like, if Jaden scrambles and the offense stays thus on the field and on track, then the offense would be performing at a significantly higher level. And if you watch that Giants game, like, Drew Lock was able to scramble all over the place. There's one play that was incredibly frustrating because he had a first down and he tried to loop back outside, and you're like, dude, just go straight towards the first down marker. But like, Jaden is taking that straight and possibly for another 30 yards. And there's a bunch of plays like that where Lock's able to get out, the pass rush lanes aren't clean. And so on top of the passing game stuff that we'll talk about in a second, and the fact that they should be able to design and run the ball at will, how's the play, Mrs. Lincoln, if you're the Saints defense? Because Jaden's ability as a scrambler should be pretty high in this game when they do manage to shut other things down.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting. And this is more of a coverage thing, but, you know, I think we were talking through when I was watching the hurries cut up for the Saints. Yeah. They play like way more man than I thought they would play. And again, if you are a scrambling quarterback and there's no vision on you, because everyone's either they're playing 2-man, you know, where they're kind of in trail pushing things to the 2 high safeties, or it's single high man and they're in trail, or they do like a little bracket man and they throw cover 3 in. It's not like they're only playing man, but they play way more man. But in those looks we just described, there's nobody watching the quarterback. And the way they play their man coverage predominantly, at least in the stuff that I was watching, is the hook. They kind of run it with like a lurk player. So it's one of the safeties as opposed to a plug player who's the linebacker right in the middle of the field. So that guy's coming from depth. And if the quarterback were to scramble there, like, it just feels like there's a lot of space in the defense for the quarterback to run. So again, like, it'll be interesting to see what the defensive coordinator for the Saints wants to do and how he wants to approach this. Because for me, I'd probably kick in a little bit more zone just because I'm aware of him. But you've seen teams that have had maybe the most success against the Commanders have played more man. So do you just say, hey, teams have had success, we do this a lot, we'll figure the scramble thing out in terms of how we handle it from a rush standpoint? I don't know. Because the other thing you alluded to there is, you know, when you watch the Pittsburgh Steelers, for example, I think they have the highest efficiency in the NFL versus scrambling quarterbacks. Like, they're able to keep them in the pocket at a really high rate. You can tell that is something that they bleed. They really are disciplined in terms of their rush integrity. With the Saints, for example, you don't really see that same discipline. On the interior, on the exterior, in terms of how they blitz people, there's a little bit kind of like go win, and it does create big creases. So they have to change something? Do they change their coverage structure, which doesn't seem like that's what they want to do, or do they change how they rush, which probably seems more effective? And are they able to do that on a week of prep? I don't know, but those are the two things you look at. They're not great in terms of rush integrity, and they definitely play more man than you would think is appropriate versus the Commanders and versus scrambling quarterback.
Yeah, Jaden. I mean, that's the thing with Jaden is he has been so much more like he's just destroyed basically zone coverages all year. And so if you're going to play zone, like he'll beat you with his arm. If you're going to play man, chances are he'll beat you with his legs. The other thing is if Cliff is going to be like he was against Tennessee and start to move Terry around a little bit more, well, now your man coverage stuff is probably going to work a little bit better because you're a little more focused on creating the exact matchups you want, using formations a little bit differently and kind of unlocking the full potential of your offense. So I think, the version that we saw against Tennessee happened for a lot of reasons, including some stuff that Tennessee was doing. But that is the version of the Commanders offense that I'm hoping to see for the final 4 games and however many playoff games they get, because it prevents some of the log jams that some teams have been able to get for Washington. It's like, okay, if we're going to play man, we know that they don't have, outside of McLaurin, a ton of guys that are just going to beat us one-on-one. We know where McLaurin is going to be, so it's easy to shade coverage that way and put our best corner over there and or safety help. Now, if Terry's moving around a little bit more, you can't do any of those things. And so I'm very curious to see kind of what the plan is and whether that was a Tennessee thing or whether that is kind of a evolution of the offense thing. Not to mention, coming out of the bye, is there any other new things that Cliff unloads in this final month of the season?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think the other thing that is going to be really interesting to watch is Zach Ertz and his ability to win versus man-to-man coverage, because a lot of people will play Zach with a safety or a nickel, but I mentioned this before, they like to bring that lurk player from the safety level to kind of be that zone-ish player, read the quarterback eyes. So the tight end, at least in the stuff that I've seen this year, is matched up versus Demario Davis. And I think Demario Davis is a very special football player. He's excellent. But in terms of like receiving and coverage, like I would probably favor Zach Ertz there. So that's a matchup that I would probably just circle in red this week and be like, can the Commanders, again, Terry's obviously one you're looking for, especially given the inconsistency in the Saints secondary. They've got some talented pieces, but they're not, playing at a super high level at the moment. So obviously Terry, but then that's a matchup that Zach has won and can win. And in a with a man coverage team, like that's super easy. Like, hey, who's got Zach, Demario Davis? Let's see if we can get a win here for our guy. And I think if you can find little wrinkles, little advantages like that in a game like this, that's going to be all the difference. Because again, I think you're going to be able to run the football, but semi-effectively. Let's say you get to a 3rd and 4, man situation, have Zach run a 10-yard out. And then we should be okay, especially if we're getting man coverage. So I think those, maybe not on the outside, maybe not on the perimeter, they don't have someone that really scares you, but I do think that's a matchup that Zach can consistently win.
Anything else that we want to hit on before we get out of here?
I think that's it. I expect them to run the ball a ton. I expect them to run the ball effectively. I expect them to be physical. I think this is always the fun thing about game planning. Whether it's at high school, it's in Pop Warner, whether it's for your rec basketball team, whatever, is I think the Saints know that we know that they're bad at stopping the run. And so teams we've played this year have changed their approach versus the Commanders because they know that this team is, despite kind of the air raid background of Cliff, like they want to run the football. So do they change what they want to do? Are they in a little bit more cover 3? Are they in a little bit more 8-man box structure like you already alluded to? And then if they do that, then what's the counterpunch for Cliff off of that? And so I think that's always the fun, to me, one of the fun things about entering these games is, like, for example, like on defense, I think for the Commanders defense and the Saints offense, like they know that we are going to want to stop the run. So do they come out and just go bombs over Baghdad on the first play to kind of get us to back up? And again, those are the cool moments that you're kind of like, oh, this could change the narrative of a game on 4 or 5 plays. And then how does our coaching staff respond? And I always think that's just important to point out.
No doubt. One last next-gen stat comparison. The Commanders actually have not been an amazing passing team off of play action this year for as well as they've run it. But the Saints are 26th in defending the pass against play action. So if they do try to sell out, getting some play action stuff on them seems like a very gettable thing. So we'll see if Jaden and Cliff and the receivers can scheme that up on Sunday.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because when you play a lot of man coverage, you have a man, but you also have a run fit. And so that was something that people talked about. Oh, when Marshawn Lattimore comes back and they can get more guys in the box, that's going to be advantageous for them. But if you're still playing man coverage, which is what Dan and Joe Witt Jr. and that staff did when they were in Dallas, it becomes really hard to fit runs still because you're of two minds. You're saying, oh, I've got the tight end. Looks like he's blocking down. My eyes go to my run fit, and then the tight end leaks out to the flat or runs a corner or whatever he's going to do. And so I do think that if you can kind of get some of those misdirections and, doing like my bye week kind of commander scouting, I think Cliff's done a great job in third and short situations of using those play actions, those heavy play actions to kind of create open runners on corners and goes and little posts to Zach Ertz and things like that. So that's definitely going to be on the table. But I think to your point, do they utilize that more in the field, on first down? Because again, like if you're going to get all this man coverage, like let's take advantage of it and find some easy throws for Jaden.
Find out on Sunday, Commanders, Saints. It's a 1 o'clock kick here on the East Coast, 12 o'clock down at the Superdome. Logan will be there, so we will have our post-game coverage 7:30 on Sunday night. So kind of after the afternoon window, we'll pop on here. TBD on who the mystery guest co-host in Logan's box will be, as he'll be traveling back with the team from New Orleans. Then we'll be back on Tuesday with a film review. Thanks again for listening. Again, we'd love to hear your feedback on the show. One, hit the like button. We don't really technically hear that, but it is a good way to say like, hey, I like that whole show. That's why I'm still watching. Thumbs up. So hit that like button on YouTube if you are watching. And if you are listening and not subscribed, go ahead and hit subscribe or follow. And by the way, happy year in review season. Logan, I don't know if you've gotten any of your Apple Podcasts or whatever year in reviews. Today in the Odyssey app is year in review day. So if you listen to us in the Odyssey app, you might get an email saying like, hey, you're a #1 fan of Take Command. If you do, share that on social media. We'd love to see it. And of course, you can go to hoffmanshow.com/survey and let us know what you think of the show. For Logan, I'm Craig. We will see you. I'll see you on Sunday. I'll see you on the radio between now and then. Logan will see you over on Command Center, and we'll be back together on Tuesday on Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command, which has a brand new home.
That's right. You can watch on YouTube at the Team 980.
You can also listen to full episodes in the free Odyssey app, which is now enabled with Apple CarPlay. So we'll just, follow you around.